go through the papers, shall we?
Yeah, let's go through the papers with anthropologist Marianne Hotter and the editor of Spiked, Tom Slater. Thanks for coming back.
Hello.
Marianne, dodgy car sellers.
Yeah, this is a really sort of like fascinating, sobering one. Lots of people are thinking about buying a second-hand car rather than buying new, but there's a sting that's been done with some of the really big online and second-hand car sellers, things like Car Giant and Kazoo. They're basically selling cars that have been written off by insurers. So you total your car, terrible damage, airbags deployed, structural damage, so you can have a category S, which is a structural damage write-off, and they're being reconditioned, new paintwork, and they're being resold.
Do you know, it's like turning the clock back, because this used to happen in the sort of 70s and 80s, that you used to get write-offs being sold as good cars. And actually, if they have been written off, they are dangerous cars.
Well, that's the thing.
Apparently, you can never produce, out of 2 bits of old car, you can never produce a properly safe car, can you?
Because if it's in another collision, there will be those weak points.
Yeah.
The airbags might not have been reinstalled correctly.
Is doing this illegal? It may be dangerous. It may be unsafe. Is it illegal?
That is a good question. No, because the sellers insist that the cars are safe.
Okay.
The insurers, I think, and these car sellers like Car Giant and Kazoo say that they check these cars against the vehicle history databases, and they undergo rigorous inspections.
There you go. Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
Inspection. So they're saying, well, But that said, when they were presented with this information, it's from the back of a Channel 4 Dispatches programme that you can watch. They said, oh, well, that didn't come up in our search history for this particular vehicle. The fact that it was written off, even though the investigative journalists have found photographs of said written off car. So obviously the
and of course these new online sellers, as you say, like those businesses that you mentioned, they specialise in making it really easy for you to buy a car. They'll sort of deliver it to your door and things like that, won't they? So
yeah, exactly.
It's the convenience of it.
So it might be that someone in the chain before it gets to Kazoo or Car Giant is pulling a fast one and doing something illegal because they're kind of fiddling the system basically, and that Kazoo and Car Giant's processes aren't picking up these dodgy cars that are coming into the system. So it might not be that Car Giant or Kazoo are doing anything wrong, but they don't have the checks in place that mean that every car on their forecourt is genuinely safe, which is exactly right, Anne. It's kind of depressing because you think, oh, I thought that was the easy and safe way to buy a car, that I knew that I was getting something that was legit and that I could trust, but
when I bought my current car, it was second-hand, and I paid, I think it was the RAC or someone to come.
That's right, I paid the AA ones too, yeah.
And they do inspections.
And they literally look for that to see if it's ever been, if there's any sign of it being, put back together after.
Yeah, but I guess these big car companies thought they were doing that as well, and yet some of these vehicles are getting through. So, I mean, I don't know what the solution is.
It's yet another rotten thing that's happening at the moment. If you're trying to save money by buying a second-hand car, you're getting stung in the tail again, aren't you, by somebody who's making a fast buck out of a bad car.
Yeah.
Tom, we were just talking to Greg Hands there, MP Greg Hands, government minister, supporter of Rishi Sunak, who says that, there needs to be, quote-unquote, tough action on Iran over the Salman Rushdie.
Exactly. So the political fallout from it here, that barbaric attack on Salman Rushdie in New York State, and so Rishi Sunak, as you've been talking to Greg Hands about as well, calling for the nuclear deal, effectively the lifting of sanctions in response to them not developing or pledging not to develop a nuclear capability, alongside making Iran's Revolutionary Guard essentially a prescribed terrorist organisation. And now, of course, in relation to culpability for this, I mean, it is crucially important and was unprecedented at the time in 1989 when you had the Ayatollah Khomeini issue this fatwa, basically putting a price on the head of a private citizen of another nation, an author who did nothing other than write a novel. That is incredibly significant. I mean, obviously, since then, the Iranian government have tried to distance themselves from that decision somewhat, but they didn't rescind the fatwa. About 10 years ago, the bounty was raised by about $500,000 by a kind of quasi-official religious organisation. So questions of consequences are naturally going to happen in that circumstance. I think the thing that we shouldn't lose sight of, though, at the same time, is that we also need to have a bit of an internal discussion, I think, in the West, in the wake of the Rushdie affair, even in the wake of the attack on Rushdie, there is still this element of almost slight equivocation, a kind of sense of saying, yes, the fatwa, or in this case the attack, is horrendous, but at the same time there are these religious sensitivities. I think this is a time which we really need to be very clear that we will not tolerate talk of murder for the writing of novels, and that's essentially what has happened in this case. And so I completely understand there's going to be discussions about Iran and their culpability for this, but I also think we need to look somewhat internally about how, not just in terms of Rushdie, but in everything ever since, the Danish cartoons, Charlie Hebdo, Samuel Paty, etc. Time and again we've seen this attacks, and time and again a lot of the time our kind of cultural establishment has sort of just looked to their shoelaces a little bit.
But it is a clash of cultures, though, isn't it? I mean, we talk about the Iranian government and the Iranian religious fundamentalist group that are clearly part of government, but they're not government. So on one hand, you might want to call it state-sanctioned terrorism, which is basically what it was against Salman Rushdie. On the other hand, is it because it's not what the government is saying, it's what the religious fundamentalists in Iran are saying? I mean, I know, Marianne, you're very uncomfortable about the politicization of this whole...
Linking it to Iran.
Well, I think because this person who has been arrested for the stabbing is a kind of a lone wolf. That's the phrase, isn't it? And obviously you can look at his social media, you can look at his Facebook and
We don't know that for certain yet.
Well,
it's
of
still
course,
very early days.
Exactly, very early days. And I think in the way that normally the media is very circumspect about making those links and kind of therefore calling a whole group of people or a whole nation into culpability for something because of something an individual has done that we don't know who they're linked to. I think we need to be a bit more careful about it with this. And I worry, I was talking to Tom in the break, I worry that it feeds into a very worrying trend that I see that is almost accepted sometimes in British culture and British media, which is basically anti-Muslim. And it doesn't, it's wrong, but it doesn't take too many leaps for people who aren't listening very carefully or thinking very clearly and sort of thoughtfully to go, oh, this person, a brown person who's foreignish, and I'm being crude here, stabbed that man. Oh, that's terrible. Oh, all those brown people with the beards, it's their fault again. And it defaults into very lazy, very, very, very dangerous racism and anti-Islamic sentiment.
I think it can go there, but we're not there yet, are we?
Well, no,
I don't know.
We're going there.
I think it's much more dangerous not to talk about these particular things. First of all, because I think the British public or Western people in general are grown up enough to be able to have this discussion without flying off into some sort of racist rage. I think the kind of low esteem that we hold people in when we're talking about these things is a problem. It's also a problem for people in places like Iran, in places where they're living under theocratic or Islamist regimes. There's a lot of liberals, there's a lot of reformers, there's a lot of moderates, there's a lot of members of sects which are deemed to be, again, heretical under some of these regimes. And when we fail to confront Islamism, not Islam, Islamism, political Islamism and extremism, we throw those people under the bus. The supposedly free West offers them no solidarity. And I think if we're talking about this particular issue, of course, we shouldn't conflate this maniac with all Muslims or all Iranians or all, I think he's of Lebanese extraction originally, or at least his parents are. At the same time, we need to talk about this as a political, ideological problem, and it's not only being, meting out horrors in Western countries. The primary victims of it are Muslims themselves in other countries around the world.
You're drawing the distinctions in Islam and Islamism, whereas others may not.
There is that, but I think most people are sophisticated enough and grown up enough to have that discussion and to make these kinds of distinctions.
I hope so. I don't think the language that we have helps. You're saying we have to draw this distinction between Islam and Islamism, and again, if people aren't listening that carefully or paying attention to what you're saying, Tom, it's very easy to get the wrong end of the wrong stick.
I think there's also a racist assumption in some of our discussion about this, which is to suggest that we can't offer full solidarity to Charlie Hebdo or Salman Rushdie or whatever because of the fact that we might upset Muslims in countries like Britain or whatever. We treat them as like volatile and as not like us and as incapable of having their views challenged, religious sensitivities preached. We almost treat them as lesser citizens when we try and hush this kind of discussion. So I think it's really important that we talk about this stuff because often the consequence of it can be really, really high.
Well, we've been discussing it a lot this morning, and we will do again. Right now, we have run out of time. So, Marianne and Tom, for the moment, thanks very much indeed.